Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am your host, Ashton Szabo. Today's show, we get to share a story from my favorite character, that of Hanuman. We've shared a lot of stories of Hanuman over the podcast, in particular some stories from his youth, like the third episode of the Savannah Podcast, which was all about Hanuman and the golden mango. Today's story is also going to be from Hanuman's youth, but it's going to offer some unique insights into concepts found in tantric yoga and yoga as a whole. It's also going to give us some great insight into our life and how we really integrate the power of our own unique individual message into the world. So the story is a brief one, but it of course starts once upon a time. And Hanuman was still a young monkey. Now, it's important to understand that Hanuman is an incarnation of Shiva. But his father was also Vayu, the wind god. So when Hanuman came into the world as a monkey, he was quite a rascal. I mean, he had these godlike powers. He was extremely strong, but he was also a young child and a monkey. So he was causing all kinds of havoc, all kinds of problems, being as kids do with all their energy. So in the area of the forest where he lived, there was lots of rishis and there was an ashram, and he was known for terrorizing all the inhabitants of the ashram. So when they were meditating, he'd come up and he would, tug on the sages' beards or their dreadlocks. He would steal meditation cushions or offerings to the altars. He was said to rip up trees and fling them around like his toys, or even terrorize the animals around, just wanting to play with everything. I know my daughter, who's just about to turn 5, she can be sometimes rough with animals she doesn't recognize, and we have to talk to her like, hey, don't be so rough. So here we have an example of just a young child, granted a monkey child, so even more energetic, and a monkey child that is not only the son of a god, but an incarnation of the god Shiva. So Hanuman is going around causing all kinds of trouble. And he kind of knows that he's a big deal, which only makes the situation that much worse. He's like, wow, what are they going to do? I'm a god, and I'm the son of Vayu, and what's the big deal? So finally the sages, they have enough. They all get together and they devise a plan of how they can get Hanuman more under their control, so he's not causing such a disruption. And they decide to curse Hanuman. And they curse Hanuman to forget who he is. And the only way that Hanuman can remember who he is through some sort of circumstance of someone telling him who he is, right? It's a reminder. It's a remembering. And this is a really important aspect, and we'll flesh it out a little bit more. But essentially, Hanuman is here and he forgets that he's divine. He forgets. This is a child growing up in our culture or in any culture, and they're filled with life. They're filled with energy. They're filled with potential. But they start that process of indoctrination. Society starts to mold them and break them down and force them into a particular shape to fit that culture. And that, in many ways, stifles the spirit of the child. It makes them forget this vast divinity that they are, and it makes them think, well, they're this little limited box, and they've got this name, and they've got these rules within their society, and they have to follow this and that. But it's not just putting that down as a blanket like bad thing. And we see this also expressed in things like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. So what's happening here is that the hero, aka you or Hanuman, but we're always talking about you, us, is that the the hero has to go through this process of indoctrination, because it's through that process that's actually going to give their ultimate message value to the world. Because the hero has to become part of the culture before they can leave the culture and ideally come back with the treasure, with the boon. Because it would be like, walking into another culture and not speaking the language. You're not going to be able to communicate. If you look at myths all throughout time, what makes myths powerful is that they speak to a very specific group of people or person in a specific time. When myths are no longer speaking to us, they lost their power. So if the metaphors don't speak to us anymore, then the myths themselves don't really have the power to transform, which is the whole point of myth to begin with. So here we have Hanuman forgetting that he is divine. And this sets forth this wonderful string of events where now he's humble. Now he recognizes wow, he thinks he's just a monkey, and he's got to work for what it is that he does. And he becomes a wonderful student. Way down the line, he becomes the student of Surya, the sun, and he becomes one of the most devoted students in all of Indian history. He masters the Vedas, he masters all these practices of yoga and pranayama and this and that. And it was because of his humility and his willingness then to learn that he is able to become such a great student. And then eventually, through his journeys, which we hear so much about, particularly in the Ramayana, but in other folk stories as well, Hanuman goes off and he becomes this wonderful hero in this story. He helps to fight demons and ultimately help to save Sita by helping Rama to find her again. And as we've spoken before in previous podcasts, Sita and Rama can represent the aspect of the small self and the big self. So the divinity and the not the ego, but the individual soul. And so those two get separated. They get separated by Ravana, who does represent the ego, and Hanuman comes in here to ultimately help reconcile and reunite these two seemingly separated things of divine self and individual soul. But so Hanuman here, through his forgetting, he's constantly reminded. He'll be, he shows up on the edge of the border of India, where it meets the sea, and he's like, well, I've got to get over to the island of Lanka, and he's like, how am I going to do that? And Jambavan, who's this bear and his friend, he reminds him, he's like, you're the son of Vayu, you can just fly over there. And he's like, oh yeah, I can fly. And he just gets up and leaps up and flies. And this, all throughout the stories, there's these reminders of him of hey, you're divine, you're God, you can do anything. And it just kind of sparks that memory within him to do these great things. And that's really important, because that's a really big part of the tantric message. The tantric message is that you've forgotten who you are. You've misidentified. You've experienced things through your senses, and you've thought that you are those things. So I experience myself as tall or as short or as skinny or as large or as this or as that. And so you've identified with those things instead of that grand thing. And all it takes is a remembering, a reminder. Sometimes it's from a friend that can just kind of knock you out of your head and ego and say hey, you're being a total dingbat right now, get back to reality. Or maybe it's a sacred text. I can pick up certain texts that anytime I pick them up, they remind me of oh my gosh, that's right. I'm so caught up in my own limited ego self that all it takes is one beautiful, powerful line from something to annihilate that and bring me back into an understanding, into an experience of oneness and togetherness, of remembering who I am. But again, the important part of this going through the process of education and, in a very true sense, indoctrination, right? So the rishis kind of indoctrinate Hanuman so he doesn't remember that he's divine. He's got to be just like one of us. This being just like one of us is really, really important, because it adds so much of the value back to the message. So in this basic hero archetype, you've got the hero that leaves their culture, goes and slays their dragons, receives the boons, and then brings those boons back to the culture. But again, what gives those boons the most value to the culture, not necessarily to the person, but as a shared experience, as a collective evolution, is how those boons, how those treasures are communicated back to the people. And so if you're coming from a culture that just doesn't understand, like if I would walk up to a desert community and start talking about metaphors that talk about the deep ocean and sea and all the things that happen if you were to spend every day in the sea, that, hey, maybe an island living culture would totally get instantaneously, the people in the desert are going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't even understand what you're saying right now. And so that's a key characteristic here, is that by going through the indoctrination process, you're learning the vocabulary, you're learning the language, so that when you remember who you are, when you go on your hero's journey, when you slay your dragons and overcome the things that are in your way, you can bring that journey, that message back to the people and communicate it in a way that they can really hear you. I remember when I first came back to the United States, I had spent a lot of years on a small island. I didn't have exposure to a ton of people. And most of the people that I was interacting with were pretty serious and committed to their study of yoga, and they're wanting to get deeper inside themselves. And I got back to the United States, and I was still on that same train. I was like, oh yeah, everybody wants to realize the divine and become enlightened, and this is what yoga's for. But the vast majority of people were just doing yoga because they wanted to feel better. They wanted a little bit more flexible, to be a little bit more flexible, or they wanted to have a calmer mind. So to come at them with the language of like, hey, this is how you're gonna ultimately perhaps become enlightened, it didn't resonate with people. It didn't connect with people in the same way. So it took my willingness to open up into their perspective more and to hear what it was that they wanted. And that wouldn't have been possible or as possible had I not grown up in that culture. But because I'd grown up in the culture, it was very easy for me to redirect and say, okay, these are the needs, this is the language that these people speak. And so I changed my perspective to meet them where they are at. And it completely opened up not only my capacities of teaching, but people's willingness and receptiveness to learn and to understand, and to go deeper inside themselves and learn more about the divine. But it didn't come by speaking some foreign, lofty language. I mean, a big part of our podcast here with the Savannah podcast is to communicate things in a way that's very down to earth and accessible, because that's what really inspires people to go deeper. And maybe they will go and learn a different language, so to speak, at some point. And that's great as well. But it all starts from that, coming from the language that we already speak. Now, I want to touch as well on a concept of what's called grace, of anugraha, right? So a remembering, and this is an important facet of it, a remembering is, you don't do something to remember something. You might have someone or something trigger your remembering, but it doesn't give you something because you've already had it. And that is super key. So the remembering, it's already there. Right? So I'm not doing a yoga practice to get to a certain place, to a certain level of cultivation where then I will be enlightened or then I will get something. Rather, it might take a lifetime, it might take a few months, a few years, a particular teacher, a particular text, a particular this, or simply just walking down the street one day to trigger that memory, to trigger that thing. But the key is didn't make that thing, it didn't build that thing. That thing was already there. So when Hanuman is reminded that he is the son of Vayu, the son of the wind god, or that he is an incarnation of Shiva, he didn't do something to earn that or to get that. That was already there. And that's a central message in Tantric Yoga, that you already are divine. It's a realization. It's a remembering. And that's why they call it anugraha, why they call it grace. You don't do something to get grace. You might ask for grace, you might pray for grace, but you don't actually, it's not that action that it happens. What makes it grace is precisely because there's nothing you can do to get it. It's grace. And that's the same here. The message here is that you already have it. You already are it. So you need to remember it. And maybe you're totally locked in your life right now and you're like, man, I'm totally indoctrinated in the culture. I'm completely, in it. And I don't remember any of this stuff from my childhood or any time in my life where I feel that. Well, then that's the importance of friends, of spiritual community, of sacred texts, of practices, these things that remind us of that which is already there, of that which you already are. And that's really the beautiful message here, is it's not a form of spiritual materialism where we're going to acquire more things, and once we get enough, then we'll be at that pinnacle, we'll be at that place that we want to get. The whole point is to simply remember that we're already there, and to be grateful for the experience of that indoctrination, of that forgetting, because it's precisely that process that not only allows the experience of revelation, of remembering, but it adds that critical element of collective evolution where we can now share our experience, where we can share our message in a way that other people can understand it, that it can call to them as well and inspire them on their particular journey. It can inspire them to remember who they are. All right, so that's our story for today. I hope you've enjoyed listening. I hope you've learned a little something new. I hope it helps you to remember who you truly are. As a reminder, please go to iTunes, leave a review, leave a comment. It helps to both spread the message of our show. It also gives us important feedback on how we can make the show better, areas that we can improve on, areas where we continue to offer things that you guys want to hear. I'm also gonna, as we do with the story times, is share one of those reviews. So this review is from Audio82. She says, "Thank you. Your shows are beautiful. Just finished listening to the story of Sarasvati, and before that I listened to the Transcendental Meditation episode. Now I'm about to dive into the Hanuman story. The knowledge is staggering. Thank you, my friend." Added an extra bit to it saying, "Just finished part 1 of the Ganesha story, and now I'm incredibly addicted to this podcast. I've learned more in the last 2 days than I have in the last 10 years. The down-to-earth explanations have really been the missing piece to the puzzle for me. Again, thank you so much." Well, thank you, Audio82, for listening and for going on and leaving us that comment and that rating. We really appreciate it. I'm glad you've been enjoying them. We'll continue to create them as long as we can. We create them with the help, of course, of Savannah Spirit, who makes all of these episodes possible. Great opportunity as well to mention Zach Cooper, our sound engineer, who brings all these amazing stories to life and helps them sound so much better. Again, thank you all for listening. We really appreciate your support. Please share this with your friends. Tell other people about it. Help us grow the podcast that much more. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.